Hi, welcome back. And we're going to continue our talk on ancient Egypt here and the New Kingdom by looking at three more pharaohs and the fall of the New Kingdom. In part one, we talked about really that Hatshepsut was one of the only female queens that ruled, and she actually had quite a prosperous reign as pharaoh. So we're going to continue on here as we look at some more important New Kingdom pharaohs. The pharaoh that follows Hatshepsut is Thutmose III. Now, she was his stepmother. As we know, there's some really kind of odd relations when it came to pharaohs in ancient Egypt. Some of them married their sisters and things like that. So there's no doubt that both Hatshepsut and Thutmose were related, and they both wanted power. And unfortunately, when you're the male, you tend to get that power, and you're able to take it away from your stepmother in this case. And that's exactly what Thutmose III is going to do. So he was much more warlike than Hatshepsut. We said Hatshepsut focused on trade, and her reign was very prosperous of it. Thutmose wanted to be remembered as a warrior, and truth be told, he was a military genius. He was able to expand Egypt's boundaries and win a number of battles. There's no doubt, and we look at this from the historical records, his success on the battlefield was very high. So he was eager to take power. Now, we're not exactly sure what happened to Hatshepsut. We have her body now. We don't know if maybe she was murdered. We know that Thutmose came to age and wanted to rule. I mean, he was the rightful heir to the throne. So it's possible he might have had Hatshepsut killed so that he could take power for himself. So that's one of those historical rumors, one of those historical urban legends. We don't know if it's true or not, but he may have murdered his stepmother. And I mentioned this when I talked about her in part one, but he had any picture of Hatshepsut destroyed. And Egyptians believe this erased your soul from the afterlife. So, I mean, think about this. He doesn't want people to remember her as pharaoh because he's bitter that she ruled for him. But on top of that, it's actually, in their culture, erasing you from where your soul goes after you die. And this was a pretty big thing. Lucky for us, not all of the records were destroyed, and we were able to study her and understand what a great pharaoh she truly was. Thutmose's armies pushed south into Nubia and were able to take power there. There's no doubt there's a lot of gold down in Nubia, and this became the peak of his Egyptian reign. There's a lot of evidence to show that this was really the kind of expansion point of the New Kingdom, to the point where the size of the empire was as large as it had ever been. Now, one of the next pharaohs that comes along is King Tut. And what's interesting about King Tut is not so much what he did as pharaoh, it's more the discovery that we found inside his tomb. And so I found these two images very synonymous with King Tut. These were his his masks, his death masks, his coffin masks. But you'll see here, the King Tut exhibit has been traveling around the globe for decades because we found so many cool things in his tomb that been able to go and see these at places like museums. Even here in Minnesota, I was here a couple of years ago, so we'll talk about that. So King Tut. History remembers King Tutankhamun more for the discovery of his tomb in 1922 by Howard Carter rather than his reign as pharaoh. It's kind of an interesting story because as they started to uncover what they thought might be a tomb, they found some stairs. And Howard Carter and his team basically had to painstakingly brush the sand and dirt away from these stairs. And it took about a year to go down just one flight of stairs to the door of a tomb, but they didn't really know what was in there yet. They knew they were at some new tomb, and they kind of cracked it open and shined a light inside there, and they could see things reflecting. And they knew they had found something pretty spectacular. So they went in there and they found all these trinkets, and they found a sarcophagus with a mummy, and they realized, okay, King Tut here, he was a pretty young guy. And he only ruled for about 10 years and was only about 18 when he died. So sometimes you'll hear King Tut called the boy king. Because he didn't quite even make it to age 20. So in that amount of time, he did a couple of things. He moved the capital. He reestablished Egyptian religion. But he didn't build a lot of big things, and he's not really remembered as like this remarkable ruler. We all know King Tut because of his tomb. Couple of things that they say: he possibly died of an infection and a broken leg. Oftentimes, a broken leg, if severe enough, can actually kill you. I mean, think of the time we live in today where a broken leg, you go get it set, you put a cast on and it heals. Nobody ever worries about dying from a broken leg, but in that time you did. There's a possibility that he might have died of malaria. Some people say he might have even gotten killed. There's a fracture to his skull. So there's a lot of different theories as to how King Tut died. Here's a picture of King Tut's tomb being unearthed. Again, it would have been a very, very painstakingly slow process to dig your way down into his tomb, because when you're talking about something that's a couple thousand years old, as this is, every little rock, every little bone could mean something. So you have to be very, very careful in how you unearth a tomb like this. This is a picture of when King Tut, in his exhibit, was in New York City a number of years ago. A lot of gold was found in there. I mean, it's not a real big tomb. And that's why there's some kind of interesting stories going around it today. British archaeologists is actually going into his tomb, and they've done a lot of research, and they think his mother, Queen Nefertiti, might also be buried in his tomb behind a false wall. Problem is, you can't just start digging these walls. These walls are beautiful. They're painted. There's hieroglyphics. It's the wall right adjacent to his sarcophagus where that was found. So they're not really sure how they're going to get on the other side of that wall, but there might be a lot of mystery still to uncover within King Tut's tomb. But anyway, this exhibit has been traveling the globe. I came to the Science Museum in Minnesota a few years ago. I had some former students of mine from, I think they were, I want to say 2011 grad. Sorry, ladies, if I'm wrong with that. But they went and saw the exhibit, and they said it was really awesome. I unfortunately didn't get to see it, but it has been here to at least Minnesota, which is pretty cool. The last pharaoh we need to talk about might arguably be the most important pharaoh, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that he ruled for 67 years, and that's Rameses the Great. You can see a picture of what we think Ramses looked like on the left, and we do have his mummy on the right, and he died in his 90s. That's pretty remarkable for a time period where adulthood you were lucky to last past 30 or 40. So let's talk a little bit about Rameses the Great here. Rameses the Great, also known as Ramses II. There are a number of different spellings of his name. Sometimes you'll hear him referred to as Ramesses. Sometimes it's Ramses. Sometimes it's Ramses II. Sometimes it's Ramses the Great. Ramses did kind of a little bit of everything. He built, he made peace, he made war, he kind of did everything. He made a peace treaty with a neighboring group called the Hittites, which lasted almost 100 years. And this is smart because though he will wage some wars, this is kind of making a friend out of one of your enemies. And when you have that, you know you don't have to worry about them nipping at your borders. So this allows you to continue either waging war against the people you really need to wage war against, or it allows you to build and do things internally within your kingdom, which we will talk about here in a minute. He created a great temple to the god Amun-Ra at Karnak. That's one of the temples, but the more important temple that we're going to look at is Abu Simbel. He created the magnificent temple at Abu Simbel, and Abu Simbel is well known for the 4 giant statues of Ramses that are out front. It had to be moved due to the rising waters of Lake Nasser. Now, if you've seen Egypt Engineering Empire, and I know my classes have, this is pretty cool. In the 1960s, they literally had to dismantle this temple using cranes and saws and all sorts of different things and move it back a couple hundred yards, because when they built the Aswan High Dam on the Nile, of course, anytime you build a dam, it makes a lake behind it, and we were going to lose this temple to progress. I mean, the water was going to rise and absolutely swallow up this temple. So it's pretty cool that the Egyptians and several other agencies were able to actually take this apart piece by piece and put it back together. And you've seen this if you're in my class. Otherwise, I'm going to definitely show you pictures here on the next slide. We know that Ramses had an enormous ego. He really loved himself. He had hundreds of statues carved of himself all over the kingdom. You can see that in Abu Simbel, not only in the outside, but on the inside as well. We know that he worshipped himself as a god. He had himself showing pictures of himself, worshiping himself as a god. I mean, that's ego right there. We also know that he had a lot of children. Estimates show that he had well over 100 children. Many of them he outlived. Some say he had 100 sons and 100 daughters. Clearly, he felt it was important to have a lot of children. He felt that he was the top of the social pyramid, so to speak, and having his royal blood in you made you even more important. So, I don't know if that's just a fancy way of saying he liked women, and maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but we know he had a lot of children. I told you he worshipped himself as a god. There's no doubt about that. We have detailed hieroglyphics that prove that. He reigned for 67 years and died roughly at the age of 90. You know, one of the things I didn't put on here is he won battles. He expanded territory. He was very successful on the battlefield. The interesting thing about Ramses, too, is if you know your biblical history, the Bible says he is the brother of Moses. And he and Moses grew up as brothers. And if you know Moses' story, eventually Moses was outed as a Hebrew and eventually led the Hebrew slaves out of bondage in Egypt. Some historians say the math doesn't really add up, that Ramses and Moses wouldn't have lived at the same time. At least that's what the Bible either says, or the Bible's very kind of pointed in that direction, that it was Ramses and Moses. Here's the picture of Abu Simbel as the water is getting higher. I'll show you a couple better pictures here. This one is the much clearer picture. You can see the 4 giant statues of Ramses out front. You go inside here, and there's even more statues of Ramses. Pretty beautiful temple. Next to it, and we'll go back 2 slides here, you can see here's Ramses' temple and the temple for his queen. So let's zoom in on his temple for his queen. You can see the statues of the queen are nearly as tall or just as tall as the statues of Ramses. And that was done intentionally because this was for his favorite queen, Nefertari, who we think is the queen he loved the most. Now, the New Kingdom does fall. The New Kingdom would see many successors to Ramses II, but none of them had quite the same amount of power, none of them with as great amount of power. Many of Ramses II's heirs would bicker over power, and that's problematic. We'll see that in a couple other places in history. Sons, and usually his sons, trying to be as powerful as dad, end up fighting each other over who should rule or who should have land. Ramses III is considered to be one of the last great New Kingdom pharaohs. Definitely one of his sons. I'm not going to talk about much of him specifically, but it's really downhill from here. Eventually, a bunch of different groups would come into this region. When you don't have enough power militarily, you don't have enough money enough power politically, you don't have enough money, it can be very easy for other groups to move in and try to start taking what is yours. So eventually the Philistines, Libyans, and Hittites would reduce Egypt to a series of broken up regional units. The power base wasn't strong enough in Egypt to keep it intact, and so it slowly started to break up. Then another very powerful foe would eventually move in and dominate, and they were called the Assyrians. You didn't want to mess with the Assyrians. If you look at this map, the Assyrians eventually conquered a very large piece of territory, including all of Mesopotamia, a lot of modern-day Saudi Arabia, and all the way down into Egypt. And they were fighters. So let's briefly talk about who the Assyrians were, because they're going to help end the New Kingdom here. So the Assyrians were definitely a mighty military machine. I mean, we know that their military tactics were fearsome, very well trained, and almost unstoppable. You just didn't want to come up across the Assyrians. We know they used ladders to scale city walls. So if you can't go through a wall, you go over it. We know they used iron-tipped spears, swords, and daggers. Now that's important because iron is very, very strong. It can mold it into different shapes. And so if everybody's using stone or bronze and you come along using iron, you've got an advantage because you've got better weapons. Now, one of the things that they did is they used torture to demoralize their enemy. They essentially gathered up prisoners from places that they took over, brought them to the middle of town and said, here's what happens if you don't listen to us. And they tortured them and killed them in front of an audience. And that was done to send a direct message to anybody who would consider themselves an enemy of the Assyrians. And a lot of times people would just lay their weapons down and say, all right, we submit, please take over us and we'll do whatever you want. So Assyrian torture was a very real thing. We know they tunneled under city walls to attack them, so if you can't go over the wall, you can't go through the wall, why not go under the wall? And of course, when you go under a wall, you're also going to weaken that wall to the point where it may collapse, and then you can go through. Their capital was Nineveh. Nineveh was a map item I had you label on your map assignment. It's really kind of right in Iraq. It was home to a library with over 20,000 clay tablets, which is pretty cool. Definitely a place where knowledge was starting to be hoarded and stored. But just like anybody else, the Assyrians themselves were eventually conquered, so they were defeated by a combined army of Medes and Chaldeans, a couple of different groups that once controlled that region, none of which would ever get to the height of the Egyptians or the Assyrian power. So that pretty much brings the New Kingdom to a close. So when we bring this to a close, we're not only just ending the New Kingdom, we're ending all of Egyptian history. Though some of the Egyptians would hold on, their time in history is pretty much over. So here's our result of Egypt. The Egyptians ruled Egypt and the New Kingdom for roughly 500 years before they were eventually replaced by the Nubians and Assyrians, thus ending Egyptian rule of the territory. Though their people have disappeared, the ancient Egyptians left us with an amazing culture that built pyramids, tombs, and obelisks, carved really awesome hieroglyphics, mummified bodies, and stood out as one of the most unique peoples of the ancient world. And when we talk about these things, pyramids, tombs, obelisks, hieroglyphics, and mummified bodies, you don't see that in other cultures. Cultures tend to absorb things from other cultures. I mean, we're not original anymore. What we got from somebody else. And we just made it part of our own. But the Egyptians, they did these things first, and no one's really done some of these things since. There are going to be other groups that use glyphs or hieroglyphics, but not in the same way that Egyptians did. We don't really see other groups mummifying bodies like them. We don't see people building afterlife chambers like the Egyptians did. So when I say they're one of the unique peoples on the planet, I truly mean it. All right, let's wrap up the New Kingdom by looking at our constructive response questions. First question says, generalize who the Hyksos were and defend why the New Kingdom is considered Egypt's golden age. Well, the Hyksos were foreign invaders who moved in and took over Egypt during the later part of the Middle Kingdom period. So the Egyptians weren't ruled by Egyptians anymore, they were ruled by these foreign Hyksos. Well, that leads us to Amos and Kamos's story of how they want to rid Egypt of the Hyksos. Now, not everybody was upset with Hyksos rule, but Amos and Kamos, being princes of Egypt, wanted to do something about it. Kamos is killed while he's fighting the Hyksos. We're not sure if he's actually killed by the Hyksos or not, but he is killed. And his brother Amos, 10 years later, then is able to rise up and push the Hyksos out. Because of that, the New Kingdom period of Egypt is able to start. So the second half of this question says, defend why the New Kingdom is considered Egypt's golden age. Well, that actually plays into our next question, because the way you would want to answer that is by talking about some of the great New Kingdom pharaohs. They are what made Egypt or the New Kingdom of Egypt, the Golden Age. So we can actually use part of question 4 to answer part of 3. So I'm going to go on to question 4 and describe those pharaohs, and you might use that to answer both questions. So number 4 says, describe the legacies of 2 of the New Kingdom pharaohs. Well, we actually talked about 5 really big ones here in this lecture. The first one is Amos. I mean, pushing out the Hyksos and becoming pharaoh, starting the New Kingdom, is a pretty big deal. The next one we talked about was Hatshepsut. She was the female that shouldn't have had power, and because of her friends at court, she was able to basically rule and make herself pharaoh. She dressed like a man, so people would take her more seriously, although that may not happen in the modern world all the time, but you never know. And she built obelisks, she built a really beautiful palace at Deir el-Bahri, and promoted trade within her reign. After that, her stepson Thutmose III takes over. He's much more warlike. He adds a lot of land to Egypt's empire, and it really becomes the peak of expansion for the New Kingdom. After that, we have King Tut. Now, King Tut's not real remarkable as a pharaoh, but his tomb taught us so much about Egypt with all the great stuff that was in there, gold trinkets and sarcophagus and hieroglyphics and all this kind of stuff, because when Howard Carter found his tomb in 1922, it really hadn't been disturbed. So we could learn a lot about Egypt and the New Kingdom based on King Tut's tomb. The last of the New Kingdom pharaohs that we looked at is Rameses the Great. Rameses the Great ruled for 67 years. He died when he was 90. He was really famous for building the temple at Abu Simbel, that huge temple that had 4 giant statues out front that we saw several pictures of.
He had signed a peace treaty with the Hittites. I mean, he had done a lot of remarkable things during his time period. So to answer question 4, you would just need to talk about 2 of those pharaohs, but also to answer number 3, you could talk about a couple of those pharaohs because they make Egypt and the New Kingdom its golden age. So you would use the pharaohs in both of these questions here. So that's going to do it for us here today. That's going to do it for us on our Egypt part of this unit. Next part, we're going to move on to Judaism. So I hope you learned something. We'll see you next time.